Hello, my name is Dr. Jim Doty, and I'm the host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast, where we explore the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart. Hi, this is Dr. Jim Doty, host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast. My guest today is Sensei Koshin Paley Ellison, Zen teacher, Jungian psychotherapist, author, most recently, of Untangled, Walking the Eightfold Path to Clarity, Courage, and Compassion. Koshin is also the co-founder of the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. We're going to talk a bit about his path to becoming a Zen teacher. I hope you enjoy. Well, Koshin, it's great to see you now for our third time after having a few technical failures. I think our internet is stable. We have a new computer, so I think we're good to go here. If you recall, and I hate to sort of make you relive, topics that can be uncomfortable, but I think for a lot of people, they want to understand how you got to where you're at today. And for many of us, that journey has oftentimes been painful. And so, if I recall correctly, you had started telling me a story about your teacher in the studio, and it was at a martial arts studio, if I recall correctly.
Yes. Yeah, so I grew up in a home of well-meaning people, and yet, as many of us struggle with, that there's a big difference between well-meaning and what we're actually doing, and where people's values, my parents and different people's values, and what they actually were doing were quite, in moments, were an incredible chasm, and in moments were together. And I think that creates a lot of confusion. So that there was, sexual abuse and physical abuse, and certainly verbal and emotional difficulties. And so I was really in the state of really looking for refuge. And so I had, one of the places of refuge was cinema, was movies. And when people used to go to movies, and and the movie theater was an amazing place as a child. And so I used to bike down to the mall with my best friend Jason on our little banana seat bikes, and we saw the first Star Wars movie. And I remember, wow, thinking you could actually have a teacher. And the idea of that, and I think the image of that was the first Star Wars. Luke Skywalker was like living in, his parents weren't his parents, which is kind of how I felt. And he felt like he belonged somewhere else, which I also felt, that I couldn't feel a sense of home and a sense of steadiness. And he met a teacher like out in the world, but not in school. And so I thought, wow, that's incredible. And I just also loved that how whiny he was. And he was always complaining, because I felt that way too. And I think that's what makes him relatable as a character. Just like, he wants. And, but yet I didn't know how to become a Jedi. I didn't know where Tatooine really was. And so I knew that I needed to find a teacher, but I didn't know how. And it was soon after that this other film came out, which called The Karate Kid. And there was also the same motif of a whiny kid complaining and finds a teacher, Mr. Miyagi, famously. And I realized, you could find one at a karate karate. So I went to the local strip mall was really just a short walk from our house in the suburbs, and beneath the basement beneath the basement of the drugstore, Phase Drugs, was this karate school that was like dank and pretty nasty and serious. Like people went there were mostly adults. It was not one of those karate schools with like kids classes, like it was like, and I was 11 years old, and this teacher, Sensei White was his name, and this kind of makeshift wooden floor would have us sit in seiza where your knees are underneath yourself, and it was so painful. And but he would walk around us in such a steady, grounded way, and used to say over and over and over again, you will never be free until you can be still with your pain. And this continues to this very day to be a powerful teaching. And as an 11-year-old, I felt like I was learning superhero business. And it was also, I didn't understand this as a child, but I think it was really the beginning of compassion for me. That I understood that the people in my house just didn't know how to be still with their pain. They were just flailing and reacting and didn't know how to hold their pain. And so it was very super poignant and powerful, and maybe even beautiful to learn how to be sweating with excruciating pain and also realizing there was something else, that there was a taste of freedom. Yeah.
In that process, though, and we've talked about this a little bit previously, but you were struggling, though, with your own sexuality, and also, I think, the fact that you were being bullied. And how do you think that was this? You had your own pain, and was the suffering that was caused by the practice in the karate studio, was that in some ways trying to substitute the pain you were having and deal with it? Uh, or was it just actually, in some ways, being a masochist and sort of saying, well, I'm suffering here, I'm going to suffer there, and life is suffering, and that's just the way it is?
Mm. I think that it was actually, I was a young gay kid, and actually really, and at my bus stop for school was the school bully, and it was like, a gauntlet of, going from a house where I didn't feel safe to the bus stop where I didn't feel safe to school where I didn't feel safe. There were not a lot of places of refuge. And the karate school studio felt like a refuge. It felt like a training. It didn't feel like a home, but it felt like a place where I was actually learning what I needed. And the kind of heartbreaking part of that whole thing was that at a certain point, the school bully just kept pushing me down one day. This is after years. And one of Sensei White's teachings was like, you must never use this to fight. And one day, after being called a fag so many times and being like, literally my face being ground into the gravel, I just said, enough. And I just stood up and I felt powerful. And he's like, oh, yeah, what are you going to do about it, fag? And I just remember thinking, just leave me alone. And at that time, I was actually quite skilled at martial arts. But I was like, just leave me alone. He's like, what are you going to do, fag? And he started pushing me and pushing me. And I just said, I'm not going to let you do this anymore. And I really, just something inside of me snapped. And I defended myself and stopped him. And his mother, I remember yelling out the window for the second floor of their house. We're right there. And she was like, what are you doing to my son? I was like, you should take care of your son because your son is an asshole, And the next day, and I was so embarrassed actually, because I knew for some reason I felt like I couldn't tell Sensei White that I had done this. So I never went back to the karate school ever again. And because I felt like I betrayed a fundamental creed in a way. And at the same time, suddenly when I was like felt like the least popular kid in the school, the next day I was a hero. Walking down those hallways, everyone was giving me high fives. Somehow, like people had known what I had done, and suddenly I was cool for being violent, for kind of standing up to the school bully, and it just made me so feel sick, actually. And yet, I also felt like it was a protection. So, because he never bothered me ever again.
Well, I think one of the challenges or realities of bullies is, they have their own degree of suffering. And, unless pain is dealt with, it creates pain. And,
Right.
it's in some ways, it's just horrible to see them because their actions are manifestations of their own pain. And it is hard to deal in those situations because I'm not sure if you read my book, but there was a part in it where I was being bullied and
Yes,
finally
of
stood up,
course.
and it was painful.
I know. It's awful. It's really awful.
But that being said, ultimately, it's better than having your face repeatedly shoved into the gravel at some point. But
Totally.
the sad part about it is, of course, how opinion can immediately change, right? And that's another sad statement. Instead of looking at you for who you are deep inside yourself, you have had these arbitrary judgments about you, and then they, in a microsecond, they change. And in some ways, that's just as sad as the bully suffering.
Totally. Totally. It's like, what happened to this kid? I think about him still, and like, who was he and what was going on inside of his house that he
Exactly.
would have to go out and have to bully someone else?
But also, for the other students who, immediately change their opinion, but you haven't changed.
Right.
And that in and of itself is in some ways disturbing. But I think it also does something interesting too, because um, you have to love yourself and not expect um, the love of everyone around you. And because when that happens, of course, you're always changing yourself to get the accolade, uh, but you're with a very mercurial audience. And I think unless you love yourself and are comfortable with yourself and okay with every part of you that you don't like about yourself,
Mm,
then you're going to have these challenges, I think.
definitely. Definitely. It's just, that's why I think that really how do we find practice that actually supports us in a regular way to come back to, so that kind of we're atoning, being at one with our values and being responsible and loving and caring and heartbroken all at the same time. Yeah.
No, I think that is the challenge. And, you know, people talk, and as a Jungian psychotherapist, of course, and I think I may have mentioned to you, I went through 5 years of Freudian analysis and 4 years of Jungian analysis, multiple years of just analysis. And somebody said to me, "Wow, that's a lot of therapy. What'd you get out of it?" And I said, "Well, I realized who I was and I decided not to change." But yeah, I mean, this idea of your shadow self and how to integrate that into who you are.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, to me, it's just the ongoing, ongoing curiosity and openness. And I found, these days I feel like, I've done lots of hard work to really, in particular, not feel so defended all the time. Because, I was carrying around this identity for so long, and I don't know, a good 10, 20 years, where I was just really defended, where I didn't even appear to be defended. I felt like happy-go-lucky and very confident, and yet I wouldn't let people get close because I felt that people were dangerous. And I was still running with that narrative. And I realized at a certain point that maybe part of the medicine is no narrative as medicine. I realized that, like, to really reflect on, wow, like maybe the narrative actually is poisoning me, which it was.
Well, in some ways, this is an ineffective way of dealing with your shadow, right? Because
Right.
you've created a narrative that isn't authentic. It's a method of you, I think, surviving with your anxieties and fears while not letting everyone know you have these anxiety and fears.
Totally. And it was really actually a very dear friend, my friend Liz in college, who I think I was 18 or 19, and we were walking down some street, and she just turned to me and said, you appear so happy, but you are so sad inside, and who gets to know you? And I remember thinking, holy shit, she sees me. I actually suddenly felt visible and so surprised. And she said, you need therapy, like you need to work on that so that you can actually feel known. And it was one of the most generous, loving things I think anyone had done for me up until that point. Like, it was like she cared enough to say maybe what many of us feel about someone or someone we love, but to just say it. And she said it in such a kind of just loving, kind of neutral way, just like, I just see your face and I see that chair and I see, how are you doing?
I think that sometimes we don't appreciate that, even with all the masks that we try to cover ourselves with, that there's a
Yes.
subset of people who, for whatever reason, see right through them.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think that's an incredible gift, because so many of us, with our pain, we still really want to be known and everything, and still be acknowledged, accepted, and not have judgment, just unconditional love. But I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, and I think that, reminds me of my friend Diane Meyer, when one of the things that she likes to ask her people is, how are you feeling inside of yourself? And how can we tend to that together? I mean, it's so generous, right? I think Diane too.
Sure.
It's just like, it's such a wonderful question. And it's like that I think we forget that to ask courageous questions is so generous and healing. And we just have to get over ourselves. And to do that is a true act of generosity. And I think actually what the paramitas in Buddhism are about, I think that that's what compassion is about. I think that is what generosity is about. That is what, vigor is about, is how do we be vigorous with our friendships, and how do we get vigorous with our loving action.
Well, that path can be a long, tortuous one. But if you stay on the path, of course, that ultimately liberates you.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I think dealing with your bully, although on some level it caused you a lot of pain because of your perception that you let Mr. White down, but it also liberated you in some ways to see what power actually you had within you. But I think
Right.
also oftentimes when we give our agency away by letting other people's judgments define who we are, it's not so much that you're having to bully people anymore. It's having people see the power within you
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
not being afraid of that power, but
Mm-hmm.
also letting people see that it's there. And that actually, I think, changes a lot of your interaction with people.
Oh, it's such a big deal. And I think to me, it's also has been not pretending that we're just one thing. Like, I'm not just a victim. Like, for a long time, I was really interested in maintaining that I was a victim of all of these things. I was a victim of abuse, and that people were dangerous. Therefore, people were dangerous. I, had this identity as a gay person, and that it was dangerous to be gay. That it was, all of these different things. So I'd created these walls and barriers and cages for myself. And what I think is so important at a certain point is to actually turn the jewel a bit and learn how to see, oh, yes, those things happen and they were awful. They're just objectively awful. And that's not what's happening right now. And I was in many ways dragging around for the time that I needed to drag it around, that I was like reenacting it all the time. And I think the beauty of a steady practice and community is that we can actually do something new and actually experience ourselves new. Like, oh, wait, that's not actually happening right now. No, there you are, Jim. Like, it's like, like, and you're not that guy, and you're not my father, you're not my, stepmother, or whatever that is. It's like that we're just here. And, it's almost like that kind of like taking the scales off our eyes, which I think is such a beautiful part of practice, a life of practicing, of curiosity and love is just like, oh my goodness, like, and why fairy tales are so great, because they're just so true, that we turn things into weird dreams and we live as if we're in a dream, a recurring dream or a recurring nightmare.
Well, I think, unfortunately, many children who've been traumatized carry the baggage of that trauma with them, and many actually until their deaths.
Yes.
And so often they don't appreciate how that trauma impacts every interaction, every decision, every relationship, and and I think that's why it's important to really have the self-examination. And I think it's hard unless you have somebody helping you,
Hmm.
uh, uh, because it's so easy. You're talking about community and habits. What I've experienced, as a physician, oftentimes, and I think this is analogous, a patient will come to the emergency room who English is not their first language. When they're in pain and suffering, they always revert back to their primary language. And for a lot of children who've grown up in these situations, when things get stressful, they often revert back to the behaviors that are not helpful, but it's what is comfortable and familiar versus the
Hmm.
unknown. And that, I think, is another sad reality oftentimes for so many of us.
Yes. Yes. So much. So, I think that it's almost like that's where we keep replaying, like as if that's still happening. And I think that I remember this experience I had with my father where we were walking on this beach and in Cape Cod where we spent many, many summers in Truro and he was talking about, and my dad and I are very close, and he was talking about this person who has been super difficult for me as a perpetrator, and talking about basically their good parts and defending actually. And I remember myself flying into like feeling this rage like coming up because I felt once again unprotected. Like I wanted to like gouge him, like my father. Like I just felt this incredible, like killing rage come up, and I just said, "Can we just stop for a second?" And we were like, I said, "I just need a little pause here and look out at the beautiful." And there we were in Cape Cod, which is like this beautiful place in the world, ocean, sky, and I just looked at him and like, I know you have those feelings about that person. You're entitled to have those feelings. What I realized though in that moment was just like I realized that he might not change. I can change. I love my father, love him, and I don't need to react in the same way. Like I could feel the pain of it. Look out at the sea and be like, my goodness, that's so painful. And learning how to be still with it, actually. And just be like, you know what? That's your stuff. I'm good. As long as like let's agree to disagree here, you know?
Well, I think one of the greatest lessons is understanding so often that there are different perspectives. And of course, we're always tied to our perspective. And don't get me wrong, I'm not in any way justifying the perpetrator's actions or your father not necessarily being sympathetic or understanding how much pain that caused you.
Right.
But what I am saying is that objectively, an event is an event. It only has power if you let it have power.
Right.
And I think that's what you're talking about here.
Exactly.
One is, it's like forgiveness. Until you're able to forgive, you have an attachment to an event that causes you suffering, which has nothing to do with the perpetrator.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just like that I was reliving, I was reacting in the same way. again and again and again. I mean, the Buddha was, rather clever. The wheel of suffering is a real thing. And it comes, to me, one of the names of it is rumination. Like anything that I'm like, yeah, like we keep going back to that same narrative. And it's like a closed loop. And I know it so well, and it really sucks, and it's so painful and it feels terrible. And yet we often are feeding it so that we're just like, we still keep it going, even though it feels so terrible. And to me, the beauty is, that this is one of the reasons why I wanted to try and really dive into the Four Noble Truths, which is what Untangled's about, which is like to really look at, wow, what are the causes of suffering? How do we get tangled up in our own crap? And really see what the Buddha saw, which was that, my goodness, I am the causing my own suffering, not pain, but I'm causing the suffering, which is that comes from that looping of our over attachment to, in the clinging on to the story, to the feeling, to my opinion about it, like all of it, just like, oh, it's so heavy handed. And I know it so well. And it is like recreating a nightmare. And as you were saying, like, I've known many people who have lived out there to the end of their days, staying in that suffering, staying all tangled up and knotted up. And it's just, and what's so amazing is that if we can really reckon with that, I think that to me is like also what your book is about, is that we can actually do something new. That if we can actually turn the light to where it isn't, and we can actually then realize, oh yeah, it's like I'm holding too tight, or I'm full of rage about whatever, or whatever that is, or I'm really inhabiting that fundamental delusion of that I'm alone and not connected to the world, which all of those things I know so deeply and so painfully. But once we can realize that and be embarrassed and just be like, oh, yes, 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 I do that, then we can change. Then we can actually pivot. But we have to, as my teacher, Kojima Roshi, says, like that we have to suffer. We have to suffer our suffering, and just to be like, oh, 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 so that we can actually walk the path. Because many of us want to just bypass the whole situation and go to the spiritual path and feel good.
Well, it's really interesting you bring that up, because
Mm,
I think a fundamental part of us is we want to avoid pain, right? But I think two things happen. One is, if your life is spent avoiding pain, or at least trying to live in that space where you receive accolades externally, people tell you how great you are, you can get lost in that. And then the problem, of course, with that is your ego expands, and you don't want to leave that place. And I think you also feel that you should be in that place. But I have to say, from my own experience, and I'd love to hear your comment, in those times where I've been in pain or suffered,
mm,
those are the times when I have learned about myself, my resilience,
mhm,
my strength, insights into my drivers, and the other reality is the transitory nature of many of the things that we, in our minds, we tell ourselves, "Oh my God, I can't handle this. This is
mm,
going to last forever." When in fact, uh, typically, uh, they don't. and over time, you get insights. I don't know if I told you this story. Um, at my house, at the end of my pool, I have a headless Buddha, and it's a modern art sculpture. And the Buddha is holding a persimmon. And I don't know if you eat persimmons, but
Yes.
and in fact, I planted a persimmon tree to the left of that statue. But for me, what it does symbolize is that one, not to get lost in my head, which so many of us do, but the other is that, as you know, a persimmon starts out hard and bitter. And if you have patience, it becomes soft and sweet. And I think so many of these negative experiences, when we reflect on them from a distance, we realize, in fact, that fruit ultimately became soft and sweet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also emphasizes this concept of equanimity, or this evenness of temperament.
Mm. Yeah, I mean it's such a big deal. It's so interesting you talk about persimmon because we're just as a sangha, our community here at the Zen Center, we're studying Kosho Uchiyama's Opening the Hand of Thought, where in the beginning of the book he talks about the persimmon tree.
You see?
And we're literally just reading that section this weekend. And so I'm, it's so great. And, yeah, and it's really, as one of our students here at the Zen Center says, this is just a life practice. This is the marathon. This is not a sprint. And like learning how to just slowly make our way like the persimmon, like in Japan, they often say that it takes 100 years for the tree to truly mature so that the true sweetness comes. And what I love about that is it often is beyond our lifetime. And can we cultivate the kind of patience and love and steadiness that will be for people beyond us? It's such a beautiful, beautiful image for me.
No, I think that's right. And I think one of the things that I think about is this concept of wabi-sabi, of course, and this idea of impermanence and incompleteness. And what's the third one? I will get this. Imperfect. See, I'm not a Buddhist or Zen scholar like you. I'm just a country neurosurgeon.
It's I was just talking with one of our fellows who were, so in our contemplative medicine fellowship, and she was talking about how she used to see like her challenges at home so different from her challenges at work, and so different from her challenges in her relationships. And we tend to like put everything in these like weird boxes. But if we go back to the persimmon tree, like the persimmon tree is just one thing. And that is the same, I would say, with us. Like we're just one thing. We're this one life that is not even ours, but I think that it's also an arc of our own healing where when we're so hurt, everything feels like it's about us. I know that so well. And yet the possibility is to grow and mature like the persimmon tree and to realize, I can grow and actually be rather astringent and kind of disgusting for a while, like a young persimmon tree is, and then eventually get sweeter and sweeter as I practice learning how to be loving and compassionate in every direction.
It's interesting because you were talking about this issue. On the one hand, the nature of our suffering causes us to look inward, which exacerbates our suffering. And the cure, if you will, is actually to go outward and be of service. But the paradox is that when you go outward and you're looking for affirmation, then actually that is ultimately not to your benefit, because the reality is you have to accept yourself, and it is you who decides your happiness. So it's this weird in and out type of situation, I think.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, I mean, it's such a big deal, right? It's such a big deal. And how do we, think about, one of the founders of our lineage in the Soto Zen tradition, Keizan, talked about his Dharma grandfather, Dogen. And he said, the three qualities that he embodied were, sloughing off, like learning how to slough off our stuff. And he was composed and thunderous. I just feel like it's such a wonderful trio of things, like learning how to let things move and not be over identified with, which is a practice moment by moment, and learning how to have composure and that steadiness so that we can be still with our pain, and thunderous, alive and wild. It's such a wonderful possibility for our lives.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think an amazing part of those types of teachings is you look at somebody like the Dalai Lama, of course, who's had immense suffering, yet he remains joyous and filled in many ways with immense power. And I think that's what we have to strive for. One of the things, though, I think is our attachment to a goal or an outcome that we feel is very important, yet the very nature of that attachment causes suffering.
I always feel like the most wonderful goal is to settle our heart and mind onto the ground of the Dharma so that we can actually be of service and be of help.
Well, in some ways, though, I think what that emphasizes, though, is while it's wonderful to have a goal, the fruit or the nourishment is in the path.
Oh, definitely.
And I think that's what, unfortunately, so many people forget. And the problem is when you're always looking at the goal, it's impossible to be present and enjoy what is happening on the path, I think.
Right. Because we want what we want when we want it.
Exactly. Well, we're talking about, you mentioned your book a few times, and it's a wonderful book. Maybe, and just to comment on this idea of untangled, because in some ways the nature of being tangled is there's no clear way to untangle, because it's just a mess of, let's say, string that's all intertwined and you can't see how it's even gotten tangled. And the challenge then for all of us is, how do we untangle ourselves from that? So maybe you can just comment on the book itself and what your goals were in writing the book, and what are some of the core messages. And I know we've talked about a bit of them, but maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah. So it reminds me of one of my students. She knew what I was writing about, and she had this big tangled yarn, and she decided to take it on as a practice that it is workable, but it just requires deep patience and steadfastness, humility. And for me, that's what the book is about, that it's workable and we could companion each other on this path, and that we can't do it alone. And we need to have a sense of belonging that is challenging, and that also discipline is a road to freedom.
I would just comment, at least from my own experience. On some level, I had always longed for that person, sort of a father image who would guide me, or that person who was there. And I created a narrative ultimately because, unfortunately, frequently there was no one there, and it made it very challenging, I think, to allow people to help you.
Yeah.
And I think the greatest gift we can give ourselves is to um, accept our vulnerability and our need for these things. But I think a lot of traumatized people, either they don't feel they're worthy of that, or that they're so far gone that it's not going to help.
Yeah, and I think it's really learning how to welcome discomfort and awkwardness, and really learning how to have the courage, meeting our discomfort, our awkwardness, and our pain with courage and compassion. Because it's not enough to be clear, it's not enough to know your story. What we need to do is actually have courage and compassion to meet it, because it doesn't matter what we say, it matters what we do. So, and as the great Toni Morrison says, why is too difficult? How is the place of refuge? So, like, how we live our life is everything. And it's amazing what we have as a possibility of a life.
On that note, speaking of a life, what the challenge for many people, and I think for myself, was to let individuals see my own brokenness, because by doing so and by being that vulnerable, you're afraid that somebody's going to take advantage of you. And I think this relates to wabi sabi, and maybe you can comment on that.
How we're broken is beautiful. How we're, as the great Sufi mystic Rumi talked about, that the cracks are where the light comes in. And that's where, Leonard Cohen took that also. And I think that it's just true. Like, when we see people who are real and they're funky and they're deeply imperfect because they're human, that's relatable. And I think that we don't really relate to porcelain statues. We relate to warmth. And I always think about those wire monkeys. I forget the researcher who did that, but like the wire monkey mommy, like, not so great. Like the perfect idealized mommy, like the food is there, but there's no warmth. And I feel like that our imperfections and our challenges are actually the gifts, and are what makes us trust people. You trust people who are not so sealed up. You trust people because they fall down. You trust people because they fall down, and then you watch how they get up and meet you again.
It's interesting. I obviously, like you, give a lot of talks, and usually I end up telling some poignant story, which results in my voice cracking or a tear. And I was giving one of these talks, and afterwards, a woman comes up to me. She says, I felt so sorry for you up there. You must have been so embarrassed. Everyone was looking at you and thinking about how weak you were. And I'm sure you just were shamed by that. And she said, and here's the key part. She says, I'm a psychiatrist and a hypnotist. And in 3 sessions, I can get rid of that for you. And I looked at her, I said, that, frankly, is the superpower that I have, because I'm okay with that. Right. And the thing is, when you show your vulnerability, it allows other people to show theirs. And I can remember a talk I gave to about 250 people. And again, I told some very challenging stories for me that brought forth tears. And a woman comes up to me and she says, "Can I hug you?" I said, "Of course." So I hugged her. And then all 250 people lined up to get hugged. And that is the power, I think, of being vulnerable and showing who you are.
It's everything.
Well, my friend, it is always a joy to see you. And thank you for spending this time. And there was only one mild interruption, so that's better than the 50 we had before.
I feel a lot of love for you, Jim. Yeah.
And I the same. And I look forward to being whatever it is that I do for you for your fellowship.
You're on the faculty.
Oh, I knew there was something in there. Again, thank you for being with us today. The Into the Magic Shop podcast can be found where you find your most popular podcasts, or you can find us at intothemagicshop.com.